Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jean, the Digital Event Coordinator at Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. We are part of the Info Exchange Group, a not-for-profit social enterprise that tackles the biggest social challenges by creating use of technology. Today, I'm very excited to welcome you to join the email How to Increase Your Click-Through Rate with Socha. She's the Strategic Director of Strategic Partnerships at NationBuilder. She manages customer relationships and strategic partnership for the host of the most influential political, brand, and not-for-profit organizations around the globe. She's also a political strategy leader, committed to building community in an effort to develop more effective leaders from all walks of life. She's also served as a political advisor on a number of federal, state, and municipal campaigns across New England. Before we start, we will start with a bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted. If you have any technical issues, please put it into the questions box and I'll be here to assist you. If you have any questions during the webinar, please also put into the questions box and Socha will get them answered by the end of the webinar. So we really encourage you to make it as interactive as possible. So feel free to type any questions. And also please note that your comments or questions will not be appear to the entire group. Please note that the webinar is being recorded. The recording deck and also the presentation will be sent to you in 1 to 2 business days. Finally, I would like to remind you there's a very short survey at the end, so please help us to complete that for a better experience in the future. All right, now I'll pass on to Socha for today's section. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean, and hi everyone. Really excited to be here with you all today. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Awesome. All right. So as Jean said, I head up strategic partnerships here at NationBuilder, and we build software that builds movements. So what is that software? Up first, we have a dynamic CRM. So that is where you can house your database. We've done a number of webinars on that CRM, so you can check those out for yourself. We also have a communication suite, and that's really what we're here to talk about today, is about how you're sending your emails and an email program that can actually increase and drive your click-through rate. We also have the ability to house your content management system, so your front-facing website that you're driving your supporters to every day. And then last but definitely not least in the not-for-profit space is our fundraising suite, and that is where you have the ability to use our payment processor to collect recurring one-time donations, build out fundraising programs and peer-to-peer engagement. So I always like to start any of our webinars with a grounding in our product principles here at NationBuilder. And so the first one to think about here is the concept of owning your own data. And what we mean by that is that your data is yours. It is safe, and you can access it, build into it, and take it with you at any time when you're using our software. We also want to think through putting people at the center, and that is our second core product principle, and it feeds in really importantly to when you're thinking about how do you actually increase engagement, ultimately increasing your click-through rate, right? You need to find your people, personalize that outreach, ultimately finding your leaders. Up next is this concept of moving people to action. So when we think about moving people to action, what we're thinking about in here is like, don't just build lists, right? Don't just build audiences of people. You want to build movements. You want to build engagement with folks and develop those supporters so that they can help you ultimately achieve your goals. You should use your website for action and ultimately automate for optimal engagement across the board. The last product principle that we ground in here at NationBuilder is to distribute leadership. So what we mean by that is equip your leaders, incentivize people with peer-to-peer engagement programs, ultimately allowing them to build networks on your behalf. And so just a little about some of the customers that we get the opportunity to work with every single day in Australia and New Zealand. We really do power most of the high stakes movements and campaigns and association and nonprofit efforts. And as we build and evolve our platform, we're constantly studying the history and science of community building, always trying to figure out what actually moves people to action or to do something. And there are several organizing best practices that we've baked into our platform. But the underlying is that the recognition of an important shift in what's happening in the world right now, which is that influence no longer comes from authority, it comes from trust. And so when you're thinking about your email programs, you really want to be thinking about the trust that you're ultimately building with your supporters and your community at large. So what are we here to talk about? We're here to talk about email, and we're here to talk about how do we ultimately increase that engagement rate underlying your CTR. So up first, I wanted to talk us through an introduction to email deliverability. I'm going to name off the bat here, this is a complex subject. And so today's overview is really to just get you thinking about how you can incorporate some of these tactics into your current email program, whether or not you're using NationBuilder. So up first, how do you send great emails, right? You need the right message, the right person at the right time. That's going to give you a successful email program. But that's not what actually is involved, right? So sending those great emails doesn't actually mean that they're getting delivered, right? Getting those emails delivered is hard. An email sent does not equal an email received. Internet service providers, also known as ISPs, you'll hear me talk about that throughout today's session, are able to block your email sends based on educated guesses and using algorithms to identify what your sending practices is. Your DNSBLs are able to facilitate blocks on your domain. Why is that important? That is important because if you're sending an email, yes, it's going to say it's sent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the 100 people on your email list actually received it. And so those email service providers that we're talking about here, or ISPs, are constantly regulating your sends. They're looking at the success of your historical emails so that they can then identify where you land when it comes to an inbox, whether that be in the spam folder or in the promotions folder or in the actual inbox where you really want it to be, right? So when you're thinking about this, you have to think the success of your future sends depends on your historic performance. So you really want to be intentional about what you are sending to who and when. So now I'm going to jump into some best practices on how do you implement to resolve for some of those challenges in getting email delivered. First, and pretty basic in the grand scheme of things, is your domain authentication. When we're talking about domain authentication, ideally you want to have a custom domain, right? So you're not sending email blasts from a Gmail or a Yahoo. You're sending it from your own custom domain, which you can purchase across the board. There's so many domain providers out there, and you need to make sure it's authenticated. If you send an email blast with an unauthenticated domain, you are not going to land in inboxes. You are going to land in spam. That is something that ISPs look out for. So make sure everyone here today to check that your domain is authenticated. You need to build reputation over time. And so what does that mean? That means sending smaller and targeted emails first to actually build your reputation with those ISPs over time. By warming up your domain, you're actually showing ISPs that you're not sending harmful emails or spam. And ultimately what that's going to do, it's going to allow for your reputation to continue to grow and develop as your email program does. Fresh and organic lists, right? Fresh and organic is not just for food. It is also for email engagement. So you want to think about a smaller, more engaged list that is more responsive. That's going to take more action over time than a large disengaged list. I constantly hear people talk about vanity metrics, but at the end of the day, if you're sending to 500,000 people and only 5 people are opening it, it's those 5 people that you're actually sending to. Simultaneously in there, do not purchase lists. It is just not a good idea for your email reputation as a whole. They are filled with ghost emails and spam traps, and you will get marked as a spammy sender, ultimately hurting your deliverability overall. Content. So we're going to dig into this as we go throughout the presentation, but some things to kind of think about here is your image ratio. You want to be kind of at a 60-40 or an 80-20 in terms of your ratio to image to text. Your subject lines, having them short and click and like snappy. And ultimately who your sender is. Different voices of your organization sending based on different topics. So now we want to think about how do we get it opened, right? Those are all practices to actually get it delivered. When we're thinking about how do we get it open, we're thinking about that content, right? So here thinking through things where you can add personalization, which we're going to dig into a lot as we get into the rest of the webinar. The other thing to think about here is sending from a human being. Instead of sending from, the team, send from an individual. It doesn't have to be that actual individual's email, because you can use an info @ or a team @ email address, but you can change the sender name. That makes a big impact on what we've seen here over the years at NationBuilder of how folks are more likely to open your emails. Honor the opt-in. I cannot say this enough. Honor the opt-in. Introduce yourselves to prospects, right? So people who are, you want them to be a part of your organization. We have a tool in NationBuilder called Workflows that's great for this. And Workflows basically is a way to send automated emails based on a criteria that you set for an audience. Never blast your non-supporters. Never blast people who have opted out and you've gone back in and changed. Do not do it. It's just going to hurt your reputation, and you just need to honor that opt-in. Lastly, treat your supporters with respect. And this, seems a little bit nonchalant, but what I mean by this is if someone's opted in to receive your communications and they have opted in maybe with a granular consent, right, where they've said they only want to hear about volunteer opportunities, don't send them donation asks, right? Respect. If you are giving them the opportunity to identify what types of content or the regularity at which they receive your content, give them that respect by not kind of going outside of the lines of what they've agreed to. And lastly here is target your emails. We're going to talk about this in a lot more depth, but think about this as we're going through this content. How do you target your emails, right? Do you just segment based on geography? Could you layer in additional segmentations, right? Think about that. You really want to be targeted with those emails. And lastly here, we have the concept of actually getting it engaged with. You need to have an ask, right? I know that we like newsletters and we like to send them out, but ultimately people are inundated with thousands of emails a day. If you want to stand out from the crowd, you have to make an ask and be very specific in what the impact their action will ultimately have. Personalize those asks based on previous engagements, right? An example here, ask donors to donate more than they have in the past, right? Don't just give them a blanket donation amount, make it personal to them. And lastly, always, always, always have a follow-up plan. Thank those people who actually took the action. Plan for replies. If people have a question about how to get involved, or maybe they want to do something different, you ask them to volunteer, but they couldn't make that date, and so maybe there's something else you can do. Have that planned out in your email communication strategy. Now we're moving into the life cycle of an email recipient. And so when we think about an email recipient, the first phase is our acquisition and our warm-up. You want to identify all of the ways that someone could be added to your email list. Are they joining from a specific page? You want to make sure that those pages are configured in a way that you are actually able to then communicate with those individuals. In NationBuilder, we have the ability where you can tag action. So if someone signs up on a petition page, you have the ability to say that they came from that petition page. From there, you are then able to have a kind of holistic relationship with that individual. Next up is carefully introducing recipients to your community. And what that's all about is having a warm-up series. These are new people, right? Make sure that those individuals know what to expect from you and how to actually communicate with you. Recommendation that we always give to folks is to use a sign-up page, right? So some type of page on your website that allows individuals to consent to different forms of email communication that you provide. The last thing here is that unsubscribe pages truly are your friend. Make sure that your subscription subjects you offer actually are up to date, right? If you are no longer sending out information about volunteer opportunities because of the pandemic, maybe you are just sending out event updates, right? Make sure that your unsubscribe page reflects that. The second thing to think about in this concept of a life cycle of an email recipient is listening and adjusting. So I have this in kind of a formation of 4 different buckets. The first is to measure your performance. If you suddenly get a higher than normal open or engagement rate, you need to find out what worked, right? So you can replicate that. Who were those recipients? Would you expect them to be more engaged than your average supporters? Was that email maybe more targeted than normal? If so, how do you replicate it? Those are the types of questions you want to be asking yourself when you're doing a performance measure of your email program. I highly recommend that you do email performance reviews at least once a month, so you're getting an understanding of the types of email communications that you're sending out, and then ultimately then being able to identify when did I have an uptick in engagement based on my email send, so you can iterate. On the flip side of that, if you see a sharp decline in your email stats, you also need and want to understand why that happened and how you can prevent that in the future. So things to look out for here. Is there a significant drop in your open or click rate? Who was the target of that audience and what was your ask? Did it differ from your normal email language? Was the URL for your ask configured correctly, right? So where you were sending them outside of the email, was that page different to what you normally send? Did you see a spike in bad or bounced or spam emails? Those are all indications that the individuals on that list were not expecting to receive content from you, okay? So those are things to think about in that measure performance. Like I said, try and do that monthly. It's really important to get yourselves into the habit of reviewing your email metrics and not just looking at it like, oh, we did great, we have a 10% open rate, right? Really looking at it and looking at it on an aggregate scale. Up next is A/B testing. So when you're thinking about A/B testing, this is what I mean by this is the ability to test two messages. In NationBuilder, you have the ability to do that with subject lines and senders, because we have identified over our years of experience that those are the key to test, because they can make a really huge impact with the click-through rate and the open rate. And so ideally here, what you're thinking about is personalization for increasing your engagement. And so you can test, you know, your first segment, your first A, right, of the A/B test could be without personalization. And your B could be a highly personalized email. What the hypothesis there would be is your B segment would have a much higher engagement rate, right? Once you've now assessed that, you've done some A/B testing, you can start to get more granular with it. You can start to see if putting in geographic location into your subject line increases your engagement rate. You can then start to see if sending from a sender's name that has a, you know, has a relationship with your community works better than an individual who may be newer to the team. But a lot to think about there, and how do I test the different programs and the different communications I'm sending. Moving in then to message testing. And so when you're thinking about this, there are a number of tools that you can use. Mailtester.com is one where you can look out for a spam score prior to sending. And so that's going to be scoping for that image ratio that we talked about earlier and giving you kind of what ISPs are going to look for within the body of your message. The other thing I want to kind of pose to you all today is, are there certain messages that you just know get a better response than others? You might see this in your social media content. Maybe some aspects of your social media content have really high engagement rates. How can you translate that into your email program? There's a lot of ways that you can think about the ability to pull in messaging from other areas of your digital program to impact your engagement rate. And lastly, but definitely not least, is to experiment based on engagement. So we know that personalization significantly increases donations. Drop in sentences to target people based on previous engagement. So for example here, thanks for donating last time. Please support our ongoing effort. Use your historical engagement data to continue to build the relationship with the individual, right? You want to be able to say, oh, thank you so much for signing our petition last week. You can't do that if you have disparate data. You need to be able to have a central location to understand the holistic approach of how someone's engaging with your organization, to then ultimately render it back to them within your email program. So then the last piece here in this email recipient life cycle is sunsetting and win back. Those inactive recipients, they need attention too, right? And so what I mean by an inactive recipient is someone who's been on your email list but hasn't opened an email from you in the last 60 days or 90 days. You need to identify those folks and maybe run a win-back campaign, right? A win-back campaign is where you send out a couple of last-ditch emails where you're saying to them that you're going to actually remove them from your list if they don't engage. I'm sure all of you will have received emails like that from organizations. It's an important tactic for us in the not-for-profit space to think about incorporating into our email program, because it helps you in the long run to actually remove those inactive email addresses from your list. The last piece here is list decay. And so as you can see here on the screen, 22.5% of a given email list expires over the course of a year. That is huge, 22%. You really, really need to be constantly thinking about acquisition tactics to maintain your email list size, but also those win-back campaigns so that you can kind of clean out and make sure that you have a really healthy email audience to actively engage in. Okay, so we're now going to move into the importance of personalization. But before I do that, I just want to pause for a second and see if we have any questions in the chat. I know I just went through quite a thorough overview of what it looks like for a healthy email program. So if I do have any questions, Jean, just pop that into me and I will get those answered for folks.
Sure, no problem. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, there's a questions box there. You can just type the questions and then Socha will get them answered. So you can do it during the webinars.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay, all right. So now moving into this idea of personalization and why is it so important? So up first, we are going to talk about privacy and privacy by default. This has always been a core tenet of NationBuilder, that our customers can own and effectively manage their own data. As such, what that does is ensures that your community has control over what data they are sharing, how it will be used, and ultimately who has access to it. This is extremely important to me personally and our company as a whole. Gaining consent is the first step that you need in building a strong relationship with your community. And we all know here that the world of data privacy is ever evolving. And so we have to make sure that we're compliant with things like that, right? It is really, really important to make sure that you are giving folks the opportunity to consent to communications. We believe that you can't build long-lasting communities without trust, right? I talked about that right at the top of the session, and it's really an important one to think through. One way that you can build trust is through consent and very specific, clear paths of engagement. Leadership is ultimately about people. And at the end of the day, what matters most is how you treat the members of your community, whether they be your donors, your constituents, your potential advocates, your volunteers. To lead effectively, you need to know who wants to actually be in conversation with you, right? And how they would like that conversation to take place. You have to also understand what they care about and share what's relevant to them. Being clear about the data you're collecting and why you need to use it, right? Why are you actually collecting this data? This feeds in perfectly to the idea of big data and saying goodbye to it. You have to be smarter with the data you collect. Don't just collect it, right? Teams that succeed know exactly why they need each data set that they are collecting and how to actually use that data to achieve what they are trying to in the world, right? To feed their mission. Those teams also make sense of the data that they have. They analyze it and aggregate it to paint a more complete picture of the people behind their database. The individuals behind their data actually matter most, whether they're supporters, voters, volunteers, or donors. So for example, when you are able to turn a list of email addresses into a more complete profile of who your people actually are, it's a game changer. You get a better understanding of who the people in your community are. You can establish a more meaningful relationship, which ultimately allows you to see an impactful action from your people as a result. If you collect information and don't take action based on what you find, you're not going to see results. Point blank. If you can collect 50,000 different pieces of data, but if you don't take action based on it, it's not going to work. The value of data is the potential you have to do something meaningful with it. Hopefully, something that actually creates real value to that member of the community. So let's say that you have 1.6 million in your database, right? You can identify, if you can't actually identify who the top tier are amongst those 1.6 million people, those are the ones who are going to help you drive awareness, create a movement, build a community, lead others. Then all you have is a very large email list with little value. Remember that, right? Vanity metrics is not what you need. It's engagement. So how do we do that? Up first is segmenting your list. So you can segment your list by a few different types of segments. So first up is a persona. This kind of segmentation includes things that are specific to that person, like issues that they care about, or maybe their geographic location or preferences. So let's focus on the screenshot on the right. This is a screenshot of NationBuilder, where I am using a filter to look for a person whose primary address is in the city of Melbourne, who have a tag, so an issue that they care about that they have identified, of neighborhood safety. The result gives us Alex Fields. Now we know that Alex is in Melbourne and that she cares about neighborhood safety. In the NationBuilder example that I'm talking through here, we're using tags to save this persona information in the database itself. And her location information and everything else is searchable based on a filter. In a larger database, there could be hundreds or thousands of people like Alex that are both in Melbourne and also care about neighborhood safety, right? So the next piece that we can think about here is the behavior. So this includes actions that people have taken. So for example, Alex also has a tag that says Event Attendee Fundraiser 2018. That means that Alex actually came to our fundraiser in 2018, and she would be an ideal person for us to invite to this year's fundraiser, right? Another example might be if we had all of our major donors tagged with major donor. We would probably exclude them from a small donation ask, especially if they gave recently. Can you imagine like how it would actually feel if you gave $500 to an organization one week and the next week they asked you for $10? It might feel like they actually don't know you at all, and honestly could detract from your investment with the not-for-profit. Really think about this. Think about your segmentation. The last piece we're going to talk about, I'm actually going to navigate to a new slide to talk through our life cycle. And so segmenting by life cycle, in here I'm going to focus specifically on this one email. So this is the first email that Alex received after signing up to this organization. It does three important things. It acknowledges Alex as someone new who has joined and how happy that this actually makes the organization. It then asks Alex to fill out a short survey. And if she does this, more information about the particular thing she cares about will be saved so that the not-for-profit can keep sending her targeted email communications. It also says that the organization is going to be in touch soon, leaving the expectation that she's going to receive more emails from them. So there's not going to be a surprise when another email comes from this organization. Okay. Moving into keeping it simple, right? This is so important. The last thing people want is an email that has 1,000 paragraphs in it. So some things to run you through. Images, while important, do not perform as well for calls to actions in a number of studies completed. It was so evident that button-based calls to actions actually converted better than images, regardless of the type of call to actions. Buttons in emails dramatically outperform their image counterparts, with images converting at 2.6% and buttons converting at 6.8%. Just like hold on to that for a second. An image is at 2.6 versus a button at 6.8. Why are we continuously seeing emails with imagery content if the data shows us it doesn't work? Up next, copy. Your content should be relevant to the end user. This is not me telling you to create 100 different emails, but this is me telling you to use that data to make the content in your emails dynamic. For example, if an individual in your database has a tag like we just saw with Alex that says that Alex loves libraries, and another recipient on your list, let's call it Jean, has a tag that tells you that Jean cares about schools. You need to be able to differentiate your messaging within one email for all of those different perspectives that you have. It's really important to think about that relevant copy based on the data you're collecting. Last up is to test and track In NationBuilder, we do that with a concept called recruiter IDs, but there are a number of ways you can do this if you're not using the NationBuilder platform. And thinking about specifically the ability to add recruiter IDs. And so what I mean by a recruiter ID is a way to basically track who's bringing people into your database. And so, for example, if you're sending out an email to folks and you want to attribute anyone who engages with that email to a particular fundraiser, you need a way to be able to track how individuals are interacting with it. And so for NationBuilder, that's a recruiter ID that you can just pop in to your URL. So now let's dig in more to what good calls to action look like. In a study completed by HubSpot and Experian, it was found that personalized calls to action convert 202% better. There is absolutely no surprise here. For this study, more than 330,000 calls to action were analyzed, looking at 3 primary types. The first being a basic call to action. This is a call to action that does not change based on any attributes of the visitor. It's the same for every single visitor that sees it. The second is a multivariant calls to action. These are similar to basic calls to action, but instead there are 2 or more calls to actions being tested against one another. So think A/B testing. The traffic is typically split evenly to each variation, and then you can select a winner based on which call to action converts better. Lastly is the smart call to action. These are calls to action that can be tailored to an individual, which is what I was talking about earlier with using that dynamic data that you have. There can be numerous ways that a call to action like this can adapt to a visitor, such as the information you have collected on them, their location, maybe their issue interest, etc. In this study, it also showed that personalized emails have 29% higher unique open rates and 41% higher unique click-through rates than non-personalized emails. It is so important to personalize your email communications to increase your engagement rate. Within NationBuilder, we have a feature called workflows, and this is where you have the ability to trigger an email based on how someone has behaved while they are interacting with your website. So for example, they've signed a petition, they receive a workflow with a specific call to action. But if they signed the petition and attended an event, the workflow would use that data to give them a different call to action. In our report here at NationBuilder, it shows that the personalized trigger campaigns result in more than double the transaction rates of non-personalized triggered mailings. It is so important to be able to personalize your content and use that data. So we're going to look in here about the timing of your calls to action. So, excuse me. I bet that most of you have signed a petition online using one of the platforms that are shown here on this slide. They were kind of the pioneers of petition a few years back. And what they did was pair issues of the day with actions that could be taken immediately. So when we're thinking about this, what we want to think about here is pairing an email with a timely call to action about something that is happening in the world today can ultimately create a really compelling reason for people to open the email in the first place and then click on the link to sign. So here you are seeing a petition on the right. It says, as we've, excuse me, it says, as we've seen in Australia, it's never been more important to tackle COVID-19 together, right? Right now, COVID-19 is a topic of conversation that everyone can kind of actively engage with. So this is a great example of taking an issue of the day and pairing it with an action that someone can take immediately. You're then going to send an email, right, to those supporters asking them to sign this petition. It's very likely to get a result in that email being opened because, again, it is a relevant topic to them that may not be the content that you produce all the time, but it is relevant and it allows you to gather more information on your supporters. So following on from this, after signing a petition, a person might even go another step further and take an additional action. It is so important to send a timely follow-up email with more things that an individual can do. So here is kind of an example of what that looks like. If I can get it to come on the screen, here we go. So this is the email that was sent after I signed the petition. It's giving me an update, right, about a clean energy in California, asking me to call my state assembly member. This email is extremely timely because I just took an action about getting California to 100% clean energy. And now there's actually even more I can do right in front of me, right? I haven't left my inbox. It's giving me someone the opportunity while they're still engaged, likely to result in more engagement because it's happening instantly in that time, right? So someone takes the action. When you follow up with them, you are now enabling them to continue to be in a closer relationship with your organization. All right. So moving into some more tips on personalizing your email. Get your point across in 3 lines. Bold these lines in your email. Then when you're coming into it, add the detail of each line below the bold. You also want to insert links or buttons throughout the email, but definitely not before the scroll line, right? Making people read your emails isn't impossible, but it does require thinking about where a reader is when they're reading that email and about when they last heard from you. You have to write for everyone. We don't all interact with an email in the same way. We're each individuals with different habits and strategies for understanding the concepts in an email and how we ultimately absorb that information. It's not just the readers, but the scanners as well. Some people like to read the whole email. They like detail and are at ease reading several paragraphs quickly. What you're seeing on the right-hand side is what I just read, but some of you in the room are scanners. Some of you will have just read, making people read your emails isn't impossible, but you must write for everyone, not just the readers. Sign up to learn how, right? Some of you may still be reading through the rest of the detail, but what you can see here is that I have 4 lines that convey the entire message of the email. It is so important to be able to write for everyone, okay? Writing with giving you the ability to actively engage all of your audience, how they currently read. So now moving in to writing in plain English. And what I'm talking about here is not necessarily the language English, regardless of what your language is, but keeping it simple, keeping it plain. Keep those sentences short. Use an active voice. Be personal. Use everyday words. Leave out those technical terms and instead link out to content for those people who may be interested. I want you to think about content. Maybe it's content that you sent out earlier this week. Maybe it's content that you've got going out tomorrow. But think about if you could potentially rephrase. And to get you to think through that, I'm going to walk through some examples. So this is not plain English. This reads, it's become a fact that the reef is in trouble and has suffered significant bleaching in the last decade. It's the responsibility of everyone to take action. If I was to change that to read in plain English, it would read, the reef that you know and love is in trouble. Take action to help save it. You're still conveying the same message, but in a concise and actionable manner. Let's look at another one. One of the most powerful things we can do as individuals is to get in touch with our MPs, federal and state, to urge them to support better environmental laws. We've launched a tool that can help you do this. Are you tired of lousy environmental laws that don't protect nature? Ready to tell someone that can do something about it? Get in touch with your MP by clicking here. It's very similar length, but it's conveying a completely different type of message, right? You are speaking to a larger audience when it is in short and clear English and also in an active voice, right? Each of these are driving someone to take action in the language and the tone that is being used, as opposed to what you're seeing in the longer examples in gray. So please do think about that, right? Like, pull a sentence out of your current emails and try and do this today as like an actionable takeaway from today's session. I'd love to hear if y'all actually are able to kind of change and make impact with this recommendation. So the last section that we are going to go through today is touching a little bit outside of email, really to kind of get your juices flowing and thinking about personalization throughout your supporter journey, because it ultimately leads to a increase engagement, which is what you want for that click-through rate. So we're going to start from the first moment. And so think about this as your acquisition points. You want people to join your movement. And there's a number of ways that they can actually get into a supporter journey with you. Up first is paid media. Then you have earned media, organic reach, and some supporter recruitment programs. These are all really important mechanisms to bring in new people. But the power to increase the number of people coming into your movement actually comes from personalization. You can use action button, which you're seeing right here on the right-hand side, to embed actions into any of your current CMS platforms when they're actually inspired to take action, right? It's a really easy visual way that you can create actions for folks to engage with in both a paid and earned media construct. The other tip to think about here is using QR codes. So when you are thinking about acquisition, like how do I keep my email list healthy, right? Bringing net new folks in, QR codes have become very accustomed to most folks in the past couple of years. And it's a really, really quick way to get people to your site and ultimately drive them into your programs. So think about how you can incorporate QR codes into your current acquisition strategies to build that email list. So now we've got them, right? So we've got those folks in the door. What do we do with them? The first thing is a welcome email. We touched on this earlier, but it is important to bring it up again. No matter how someone comes into your community, you should welcome them with dynamic content. Maybe it's actually just reflecting back to them on how they've just joined, or asking them what they care about, which we saw in the email that Alex had, right? These are just ways that you can think about personalizing your content so that you have a really engaged supporter from the get-go. When a new supporter joins, it is imperative to take them on a custom journey based on what you know about them. We regularly recommend to our customers across the globe that they have ladders of engagement set out for the first 90 days so that that new supporter can get a real sense of what you need from them to achieve your mission. If you don't know what a supporter cares about, you can't create personalized journeys. And I think it's really important to think about how do you fulfill, right? How do you get that data? If you don't have geographic information on folks, there are a couple of ways you can think about paid media campaigns to get folks to fill in information. You could also think about texting programs, but it really is important that you make the ask to get that data. And last but not least is understanding how they want to be communicated with. So thinking back to earlier in the session when I talked about consent and privacy as a whole, you need to ensure that people have consented to how it is that you're communicating with them to ultimately build the foundation of trust where your supporters will want to share more information with you. So how do we keep folks engaged past the first 90 days of them engaging with your organization? There are a number of tools. So up first is this concept of gamification. And when I think about gamification, there are a couple of things to think through. The first is the ability to use what we at NationBuilder call leaderboards. And this is where you can actually share, and so you're seeing this right on the right-hand side, a leaderboard, but you can basically share who is it that's at the top of a particular activity that you care about. There's so many strategies you can implement here, but what this all kind of leads into is gamification, right? You want to allow people to earn like rewards for being and doing a part of your organization. And so in NationBuilder, we call this social capital. This allows you to create basically a point system where you can incentivize your team and your supporters to actually take action and earn points to do it, right? So you are seeing that here in the Roy example, as well as in that leaderboard example. Dynamic asks, we have talked about that out the wazoo today. Make sure it is a part of your entire program, not just your first 90 days. And then lastly is similar to the personalized email, a personalized website experience is really important. If you have that data, make sure you're using it when people are in a relationship with you digitally, right? When someone's on your website and they're browsing around, maybe they're getting information about your cause, maybe they're looking for their next event or volunteer opportunity, personalize that. Make it really clear to them that you know who they are, right? They've signed in, they've joined. Reflect it back to them. Now, coming into a thing that I believe in this room will be hard to hear, which is sometimes the right thing to do is to say goodbye. It is so important. And we did talk about this earlier in the life cycle of an email recipient, but it is important enough that I have a separate section right here for it. Your email health. Everything we've talked about today, if you do not have good email health, you're not going to actually be getting delivered, right? We know that there is a big difference between an email being sent and an email being delivered. And so your email health is imperative. Some things to remember, right? Write these down, take these away with you. Your email health is looking at your domain reputation. Is your domain authenticated? Your IP reputation. If you are sending on a dedicated IP, or are you sending through a shared IP pool? It's also looking at how people are interacting with your content. Are they opening the email? Are they replying to it? Are they forwarding the email? How long are they actually spending reading your content? Are they clicking your content, right? All of those impact your email health. Sunsetting. Running a sunset campaign is that moment where you say goodbye, right? You are ultimately identifying an audience and you're saying, this group of people haven't opened our emails in a certain time period. I recommend 120 days to be kind of the dead drop, really, of like, if someone hasn't opened an email in 120 days, you should put them into a win back campaign, and ultimately you will sunset, and so opt out a good chunk of that list who no longer want to engage with you. It is better for you and your email health. Engagement campaigns. Keep people actively engaged with you. If they sign up for a petition and they receive an auto response and then you don't send them an email again for 6 months or a year, they are not going to be an active part of your community. And so keep engagement campaigns throughout your email program. And ultimately, why should they still care for your content, right? You want to continuously tell them why they should care, why they should be looking forward to receiving your emails or wanting to take more action with your organization. Keep the content fresh and keep it so that folks are able to consistently say, I love receiving emails from this organization. I get informed. I get value out of the content they're sending me. The last thing I want to talk about today is recruitment programs. And so when you think about recruitment programs, this is a way in which you are able to bring net new people into your organization. To do that, you want to find your 5%. And when I talk about your 5% with my customers, what I'm talking about here is the people who are just habitually engaging with your organization. They are constantly signing petitions. They are constantly attending events or posting on social media, opening your emails. Find those people. From there, create a custom experience for them. It's a lot of work, don't get me wrong. I have implemented it myself for my current role at NationBuilder, as well as for a number of clients and customers that I've worked with over the past kind of 10 to 12 years. But it is worth every moment of it. When I'm talking about VIP content, I'm talking about restricted content that you can only get access to because you are a part of a certain audience. That can be content that is video content. That can be user-generated content that you get some of those 5% to create. That can be an AMA with leaders of your not-for-profit, right? You can do an AMA stands for Ask Me Anything, and Ask Me Anything with your executive director. There's really easy ways that you can get creative and fresh with this VIP content. From there, you want to incentivize them to recruit friends and family. So you can use that content as an incentivization, but you can also think about, what can you give away? Is there swag that you can give? Can you highlight them in your social media content? Can you create a concept of an advocate of the month, or a supporter of the month, or a volunteer of the month? You really want to just think about, what are the incentives that would impact your community? And then ultimately, what that does is it brings in net new people so that you can start the whole process all over again, right? So taking them through the email welcome series, engaging with them, building your IP reputation, and then finding that 5%, right? So this all then starts from the beginning. Okay, so we have just had 50 minutes of content, and I would really, really love to hear from the audience of any questions that you have. about the content I've just covered, or things that you thought we would cover and weren't covered. I would love to hear from some folks.
Thank you so much, Sasha. It's such a very informative webinar. All right, so let's see if we have any questions now. We got a good questions here. So she's asking, do you have any recommendations of like what company is doing good in terms of like sending emails or newsletter, so that she can basically subscribe and then just kind of having some reference, yeah, to follow?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I will say, so I can't share that type of information from our customers' perspective, but I will say that there are a number of studies that have been done by NationBuilder, by HubSpot, and if you literally just type into Google, like email program report, email studies, you will get links out to those programs. But that's a really, really good question. I think a part of the secret sauce is seeing and like trying what other folks are doing. Sorry, I can't be more informative on that, but we don't share kind of our public client information like that.
Yeah, that's very understandable. Thank you very much. And we got Lindsay here. She's saying, wow, such a very great information. So thank you for your presentation.
Yes.
So she's just having a compliment comments. And we do have another question. It's about the cost. So because she's very at the beginning of like sending newsletter and emails. So in terms of like any paid method, how much do you think is like in general like a benchmark she can start with?
When sorry, Lindsay, if you're still here, if you could just clarify, when you're talking about a paid method, are you talking about ad spend for acquisition?
Ad spend.
Oh, ad spend for acquisition. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about ad spend for acquisition, there are a couple of kind of triggers that you want to think about pulling. So the first is, what's your total addressable market? And so when you're thinking through, your nonprofit, identifying what the total addressable market is for your nonprofit and the cause that you have. There are a number of ways that you can do that. So you can look at like specific keywords in Google AdWords. You can look at social media. So if you are doing any paid media on social, or if you're doing paid media from a press release perspective, being able to just get an understanding of like what your TAM is, that total addressable market. From there, you then want to be able to assess what it looks like to actually acquire. And so the cost, so your cost of acquisition for each of your net new supporters. And you're going to just need to test this out. So if you have a budget of $10,000 and you have an addressable market of 100 million, that is going to be extremely hard for you to get like conversions with a $10,000 spend with a 100 million person audience, right? You want to kind of hone that audience in to be looking at anywhere between kind of $2.50 and $5. It's a pretty wide range, but $2.50 to $5 for a acquisition cost and that spend that you're buying per supporter. I will name that this varies drastically industry to industry. So political versus not-for-profit versus commercial have extremely large bands when you look at the CAC, with the cost of acquisition. And so do just naming that I am talking about it from a not-for-profit rate. If you are a corporation, that is going to be much higher significantly because you're looking for new customers and new consumers. Same thing with political, you're looking for constituents and voters. They just have a very different cost.
Lovely, thank you very much. All right, so now we have John. So he's asking a very good question. So again, he is just started with the newsletter and email sendings. And he's just wondering, given that there are so many good tips in the webinar, so if he really need to prioritize and identify the most important like 3 things, what do you recommend to start with?
Yeah. Email authentication is just fundamental, like ground block that you need to do anything else. So making sure that your email is authenticated, and so that's looking at your domain to make sure that your so we have CNAME records. This will be very technical in nature, so just bear with me. So CNAME records are actually mapped correctly so that when you hit someone's inbox, the internet service provider is saying, that's an authenticated email. We are like happy to allow that email into our platform. So that is number one, make sure your domain is authenticated. Number two is if you're just starting out, you have to warm up and you have to be segmented and targeted in doing so. And so looking at very small audiences. And so maybe if you're just starting out, maybe you have an email list of 1,000 people. You don't need to send it to every single person on that list. Segment it. Identify who in that list should receive the email and do it in small batches to see how your engagement is actually doing. And then the third tip I would recommend is personalize. We talked a lot about the different ways you can personalize, but just like test it out. Use someone's name in the subject line. Add in their geography into the body of the email, right? So that's domain authentication, excuse me, IP warm up, so warming up your database, sending to smaller segments, and personalization. Those would be the top 3 things.
That's perfect. So I believe he's answered your questions, John. And he's saying thank you very much. Yeah. All right. So I guess that's pretty much for the questions. So let me have a last glance. All right. That's pretty much. So before we finish, do you have anything you'd like to speak to the audience?
Just like you all have my email address, contact information, please feel free to reach out to me. And as a Connecting Up member, you do have access to a 40% discount on NationBuilder's Pro plan. And so please do, yeah, perfect. I think Jean's pulling it up for us. And so, yeah, please do make sure to check that out in terms of the offer with NationBuilder and Connecting Up. And just thank you for coming. And the questions were great. It always is great for me to hear from the audience and get feedback. And so thank you.
Lovely, thank you so much. And then, as I said before, there's the presentation deck and also the recording, plus the link that Socha just mentioned just now. I'll be sending everything to you in 1 to 2 business days so that you can always go back and study again. And of course, you can also share with your friends and colleagues that if you find it's very useful to you. All right, so before we finish, just last single point I would like to make is the next coming up webinar. So as you can see my screen now, there's a very great webinar as well in a marketing topic, 10 things your NFP should be doing with marketing in 2022. And this webinar is on the 3rd of March for 1.5 hours. So the webinar itself will be done by our speakers, Yvette Adams from Creative Collective. The webinar itself is mainly talks about how to utilize the your resources in a smart way in order to identify which platform is the best for you to invest. And the second point is about how to evaluate what you're doing is good or not, plus doing some Google Analytics. So if you're interested in this beautiful webinar, we'll be putting this up onto the following up email as well with our discount code. So bear with us. And again, thank you so much for your attendance today. Thank you again, Socha, for your really beautiful webinar, very informative. All right, we'll see you next very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.